I am going to talk about whole system reform. How do you bring about a reform across the whole system? That is a state, a province, a country, that big. And I'm going to talk about the doing of it. Although we do write about it in terms of research and analysis, it's really the doing that I'm immersed in, and it's where we're getting the most results. And this work is only fairly recent, I'm going to say, probably 15 years old in earnest. We started in 1997 when Michael Barber and Tony Blair launched their literacy and numeracy strategy in England. And they commissioned a group of us, Ben Levin, who's I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, and myself and others, to evaluate it. So we did that from 97 to 2002. And we learned two good lessons and two things not to do. The two things we learned not to do was to be obsessive about targets. So they set targets. We actually have targets, but to be obsessive about it, which meant it kind of drove it in the wrong, misdirected way. And the second bad thing they did was punitive accountability, which I'll come back to as one of the wrong drivers, but they were doing it back then. But they compensated this for two things that were good things. One was focus on a small number of ambitious goals, and the other was capacity building, investing in the capacity not only of individuals, but leaders, literacy coaches, new roles for school principals, collective efforts at the school, the district level, and across networks in the country. So those were the lessons. Since 2002, for various reasons, they lost the plot, and then they started to go south. During that first period, they started to move up in the international ranks. Since 2003, they moved down. And the society is paying the price now because the gaps are larger. But that's another story. Let me then come to Ontario. And it's not just about Ontario. We took the best ideas we could find, some from England, some from this country. But we had the opportunity in 2003, late that year, so we started 2004, to put these systematically into practice for the whole system of Ontario. 13 million people, 2 million students, a public school system with 5,000 schools organized into 72 districts, a system that was stagnant for the previous 5 years, except for the animosity between the teachers and the previous government. But the rest was stagnant. Performance was stagnant. So that's what we started into. And you've got a very brief 3-pager on your chair as well. I'm going to use some of the slides from that. My website or my email is on, so it's easy to get in touch with me. If you want to follow up, please feel free to do that. So I used this wrong driver, right driver language last April. Actually, a group in Australia asked me to look at what they were doing in the country, but I decided to look at the US and Australia and put it in a bigger perspective. So the notion of a driver, as you'll see here, a wrong driver is a deliberate policy force that has little chance of achieving the results. Actually, when you look closely at a lot of the so-called policies and strategies, you don't find strategy there. You don't find much how to get to that. You find the visions and the goals, the aspirations, but nothing much on how to get there. So this is a definition of wrong. The right driver, the opposite. It does get you there. And so my evidence is really evidence, impact, but it's also the plausibility of the causal pathways that lead to the bad results or lead to the good ones. So here are the 4 wrong drivers. I'm going to come back to them in a little bit more detail in a couple of minutes. But it's focusing on external accountability as a driver. Remember, the word is driver here. I don't mean accountability doesn't play a role. I'll come back to that. But it doesn't play a front seat role. It is miscast if you want system reform as a lead driver. Secondly, individual versus teamwork. This country has more of an individualistic frontier tradition. Even though it has some of the best collaborative examples around in professional learning communities, it still has that cultural tradition where when you want a solution, you go for individual quality of teachers, individual quality of leaders, and not the teamness that I'm going to talk about. Third, technology as a driver, compared to pedagogy as the driver with technology in the service of that. And fourth, quite a lot of piecemeal or ad hoc versus systemic. What makes the difference in the countries that I know about that are working, and we'll we'll look a little bit at Ontario, the way we've characterized the strategy in a fairly small number of words. So that's one way of doing it. Here's, in the longer paper you have on your chair, the wrong drivers, right drivers. I analyze it more, but I'd like you to think at the front end about the 4 criteria that I'm highlighting that a driver must meet, not necessarily on day one, but in the course of having an impact. And they're pretty straightforward and almost common sense, except these go missing as criteria for how you would actually set up the strategy. Number 1, am I going here? Yeah. Does the strategy foster intrinsic motivation on the part of teachers and students to put in the effort to get the results? You can see where I'm going here with external accountability. No chance whatsoever of fostering intrinsic motivation. Does the strategy engage educators and students in continuous improvement, especially the team efforts and the collective efforts, the social capital, not just the individual human capital? Thirdly, does it inspire teamwork itself, collective teamwork or not? Mostly the solutions, when you look closely, do not. The evidence is overwhelming. Collaborative focused work on a small number of priorities, well led, with evidence and so forth. A few things I'll give you a list on in a moment, is very much associated with a large-scale success. And also, does it affect all the teachers and all the students? We would never have a strategy that says we're going to focus on the bottom 10% or 20%. It's always, everybody's included here. We are going to raise the bar and close the gap. It is going to be driven by moral purpose, but nobody is excluded. This is because if the whole system doesn't improve, the other parts won't have the context for improvement. So those are one way of putting it. I'll go back to what I call the culprits. And unfortunately, if you tend to choose one wrong driver, you almost always choose all 4. It's really perverse that way. So, external accountability, I'm sure Linda will talk about this. Using test results and teacher appraisal to reward or punish teachers in schools. There's no evidence whatsoever that this can inspire large numbers of people. It can inspire a few while it alienates the most, but it will never add up. So why do we keep doing it, I have to ask. It makes sense, you can understand it when people are in a hurry, a sense of urgency, but as we say, being right about the problem is not a strategy. You have to do things that work. Individual leadership and teacher quality, even the ones that go beyond that. I'd refer in the book or the article to Alan Auden's recent book, which is a great book called Human Capital, How Do You Attract and Retain Talent? He goes through the whole book talking about human capital, the quality of individual teachers. Doesn't mention the word social capital, even though most of his best examples are about collaborative focus. The word just seems to go missing of social capital. Technology investing, assuming that the wonders of the digital world will carry the day. I have actually a high hope for technology's help, but not as a front-end driver. And fragmented or ad hoc strategies versus things that go together, the coherence. So, this isn't a question about these wrong things being forever wrong. It's a question of sequence. It's a question of wrong drivers and right enablers, I guess I'll call them. And if you think of just accountability, here's our trade-off. You can't motivate people with negative accountability, but how do you still get accountability? We invest in really a kind of I guess I'll call it a quid pro quo agreement. Non-judgmental accountability, that's one thing, in exchange for transparency of results in practice. If you get transparency of results in practice going, and you're not too judgmental early on about it, you get actually what Richard Elmore has called internal accountability. I don't want to say too much. This comes from the list. You know what your list is. World-class standards, the new Common Core State Standards, big achievement. You get those standards and achievement going. Where is instruction in the equation? You don't see it very much. It's an afterthought. Improving teacher and principal quality, focusing on the bottom 5%, whatever. So these are not adding up to have a focus. External accountability, just a few words. I'm going to end up in a few moments, I'm conscious of the time here, about giving you our short list of what we've learned, not from me, but from Ben Levin, who was the deputy minister we hired to drive the reform internally, and our first Minister of Education, Gerard Kennedy. All of us, and this is one of the features of our reform, we're all on the same page. We worked out the strategy together, not with a lot of work, but with a common purpose and a common understanding about how to get there. I'll have to say this flat out, no system in the world, if you look at the PISA results, has ever achieved whole system reform by leading with accountability. None of them. Accountability versus professional learning interventions. Here's a very interesting finding from last year's report from the McKinsey Group, Mona Merched and Michael Barber and Company. Many of you, all of you probably know this study. They took the 22 of the highest performing systems in the world and began to look at what they did. And those systems they were able to, for the first time, I think, in this research, show what it's like to go from awful to adequate, from adequate to good, from good to great, and from great to excellent. And then they, among other things, they measured interventions, and they classified in this one piece of it that I'm going to show you, the percentage of interventions that were accountability driven versus the percentage that were professional learning driven. And look at the progression here. In the poor to adequate, it was 50-50. I'm going to put it this way. Even in the worst cases, accountability didn't dominate. It was a 50-50 proposition. Look what happens when you go next from fair to good. Accountability drops, 45%. These are their cross-sectional findings. You go to good to great, 33%, 67%, in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and others. Great to excellent. You can see where the emphasis here. What you see in this is the greater even from day one, you don't load up on accountability. But as the system capacity gets better, you rely on peers as the driver, as the source of innovation. And you have to have strategies that open that up. Human versus social capital, teamwork trumps individual work, wish we had more time to talk about it. Technology, it's seductive. It outraces pedagogy every time for the last 40 years. And then fragmented versus systemic. It's a system thing, as Mona Merched said in their study last year, the McKinsey Group. And I have to say in a word, it's the culture, really. The values, norms, skills, practices, and relationships. That's the elephant in the room that has to be actually the front part of the strategy, the core part of the strategy to change the culture. And I'm going to say the 4 right drivers conspire to change culture, actually in a fairly efficient way. We began to get results in 2 years, and we certainly consolidated those across the last 6 years in particular. Here's another way of putting it. Throw a good appraisal system in a negative culture. Good appraisal system, good tool, and you'll get alienation every time if the culture is not up to it, so to speak. So let me conclude with a couple of things here. I want to give you, Ben just did a paper for UNESCO on how to get whole system reform, and I'm sure it's available soon. And he was our internal change agent. And I'd like you to just give, because this is a practical list. This is how we think. This is what we did as a group. He said, small number of ambitious goals. You have this list in your handout. A positive stance, not negative. Emphasis on capacity building with a focus on results. Multi-level engagement with strong leadership and a guiding coalition, which is our group that has the same strategy. And then 4 more, effective use of research and data, a focus on key strategies while managing distractors, as we call them. Number 7, effective use of resources and paying attention to the system infrastructure of leadership as well as data and other kinds of resources that support implementation. As a different example, Gerard Kennedy was our first Minister of Education, and here's a politician thinking like this. In other words, thinking strategically. And he a couple of months ago was with a number of people from this country in Banff, Alberta at the Aspen Congressional Institute. So we asked him to do a short paper on what he saw as his role as Deputy Minister in this strategy. And its paper is really worth reading, but he has 5 things and just look at them. Establish a strong sense of direction around the small number of goals. Take calculated risk. A lot of risk that took by talking about what they were going to do, by going out transparently and claiming results and saying that if they don't get them, he'll resign as minister, that kind of push. Embed capacity for implementation. This is the Minister of Education talking. This is not us as researchers. Partnership based on respect, a cultural shift to one that values and results. that values results and is enterprising and innovative and getting there. So we're getting to get, I think, a good list of these, the results that Dan mentioned. I'll just give you two. 4,000 elementary schools, fairly high literacy and numeracy, not the narrow bubble test stuff, across the curriculum, measured by the independent agency that does assessment in Ontario, moved up from 54 to 69. Slow going these days, but still pushing the limits. 900 secondary schools, Dan mentioned this part. So let me conclude with a couple of things. A number of you are interested in district-wide reform. The same ideas apply in the district, although we want to see it across a whole state. But it is, and the districts we've worked some in this state, Sanger, for example, we filmed last year. We worked with the Stewart Foundation, the leadership consortium with the superintendents that are going to maybe even go further into district-wide reform. But the recognition that this is a change in district culture. It's not one school at a time, it's the district. It's a small number of core priorities. It's the notion of the guiding coalition, that is people at the district level in teams knowing what they're doing, data-driven. This is almost a mirror image of what I said at the state level or the province level. And the risk-taking non-judgmentalism combined with transparency. All of these things move up principles as instructional leaders. And then an interesting side effect here that's very encouraging. Dan mentioned the international competition. What happens when you do this in an open way with a lot of sharing of knowledge, two big good things happen. Not only within a district, not only within a state or country, but across countries, the PISA international work we're doing now, is you get a growing sense of mutual allegiance, that we're in this together. This is important for the world, not just for me. And secondly, and really very, very important, you get also a strong sense of competition. We can outdo you next year. You might have outdone us this year. It's a kind of friendly competition. It's sharing openly and daring people to get better. That's what it is, and that's actually the atmosphere we now have, as Kei-Ming knows, among the PISA group and the international benchmarking. So I want to stop with this one slide. You don't have this one slide in your packet, but we're working on some solutions now that are attempting to accelerate whole system reform in a high yield, shortest possible time, I guess I'll say it. And I think to do this, we need to integrate, and literally we are working on this, three things. You need to integrate the power of technology, wrong driver, but recast now. Huge potential, never yet being employed in the right way. Combine that with new research on pedagogy. What kind of pedagogy is going to be most engaging for students and most high yield in that? And our knowledge about change, that I was talking about there. Let me do that again. So those three, and I do mean integrate them. I mean taking the best of each of those three, putting together in a coherent strategy, and accelerating the scale of high-quality change and the depth of high-quality change. That's the challenge we have right now, and I think there's a very good knowledge base in all three of these, actually, to really put this together. Thank you very much.